When I first bought my ranch, I knew it wasn't going to be an ordinary property. Tucked away on the edge of a suburban community, it held an unusual charm. Acres of open land, a modest home, and most importantly, a large spring-fed lake that glittered like glass under the morning sun. Unlike the cookie-cutter houses that made up the HOA-run neighborhood nearby, my ranch had character, space, and independence. I didn't answer to the HOA board because technically my property existed, just outside their governing boundary. But, as I would soon learn, that didn't mean they wouldn't try to stick their noses into my business. At the center of all that drama was the woman the neighborhood half feared, half loathed, the president of the HOA, better known behind closed doors as Karen. She thrived on control. Rules about the length of grass, the color of front doors, even the number of times a family could host a backyard barbecue, she enforced them with an iron fist. For years, I stayed out of her way, content to watch her empire of pettiness from across my fence line. But everything changed the day she set her sights on my lake. The lake had always drawn attention. It was the kind of thing people liked to gossip about, wondering why one man had a slice of land that looked more like a private resort, while the rest of them were confined to postage stamp yards. Sometimes kids from the neighborhood would wander over to fish from its banks, and though I didn't mind, I kept firm boundaries. My lake was my responsibility, stocked at my expense, and cared for with time and money I invested. So when I first heard whispers that Karen had been bragging at HOA meetings about new amenities for the community, I brushed it off as just another of her grandiose exaggerations. But the whispers grew louder. Neighbors approached me casually, asking if I planned to share the lake now that Karen had supposedly secured it for community use. Others congratulated me on partnering with the HOA to make it available for neighborhood events. Confused, I denied any such arrangement, but people didn't believe me. It wasn't until one Saturday morning when I saw a group of residents setting up folding chairs and coolers on my shore that I realized something serious was happening. Karen had told everyone the lake was hers to give away. At first, I thought, it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she had worded something poorly or exaggerated her authority. But as the weekend unfolded, I overheard parents talking about lake memberships they had paid into, fees collected by Karen herself. My blood ran cold when I realized this wasn't just neighborhood gossip, it was a scheme. She had gifted the lake to her son as a kind of birthday present, bragging that it would make him the envy of his friends, while charging neighbors to use something she had no rights over. I tried to handle it quietly at first. I put up clear signs around the perimeter. Private property, no trespassing. I sent a letter to Karen, politely reminding her that the lake was on my deed, maintained at my expense, and absolutely not part of HOA-controlled land. But the signs mysteriously disappeared within days, and my letter came back torn in half and stuffed into my mailbox. It was the first real taste of what was to come, an escalating war between her delusions of control and my determination to defend what was mine. Then came the day that set everything in motion. I returned home from work to find a massive inflatable raft anchored in the middle of the lake. Laughter echoed across the water, and there, basking like he owned the world, was Karen's adult son, surrounded by a group of his friends. They had coolers of beer, music blaring, and fishing lines cast carelessly into the water. I was furious. Not because people were enjoying the lake, but because of the audacity, the smug belief that my property was theirs to claim. I confronted the group, demanding they leave. Most of them grumbled but complied, dragging the raft back to shore. But her son sneered, tossing a beer can into the water as he declared the lake was community property now. That night, Karen stormed up my driveway, wagging her finger and shrieking about how I was ruining her son's happiness. She insisted that since the HOA represented the community and I lived adjacent to it, my lake was effectively theirs. She even accused me of being selfish for not sharing. I didn't bother arguing with her delusions. I simply told her to keep off my land. That was the moment she decided to escalate. 2 days later, I heard sirens. A sheriff's deputy pulled into my driveway, lights flashing, while Karen stood proudly at the road with her arms crossed. She had called the cops on me, claiming I was threatening children by keeping them from the water. Her story was dramatic, filled with fabrications about me yelling at families and chasing kids with threats of violence. Fortunately, the deputy was professional, listened to both sides, and after seeing my deed and posted signs, told Karen in no uncertain terms that she was trespassing. But Karen didn't back down. If anything, being embarrassed by the law hardened her resolve. What she didn't realize, however, was that I wasn't just some lone ranch owner she could bully into submission. What Karen had never bothered to learn was that the HOA's financial oversight, the contracts, the budget approvals, and the audits ultimately passed through a county-level committee where I happened to serve as a key member. For years, I'd quietly reviewed their numbers, signed off on their allocations, and approved their community development funds. It was a side role I rarely thought much about, but suddenly, that position became the most powerful weapon in my arsenal, because Karen had made a fatal mistake. She had picked a fight with the very person who controlled the purse strings of her precious HOA, and as I watched her walk away that night, red-faced and fuming after the deputy dismissed her claims, I knew this battle had only just begun. The lake was mine, but soon, so would be her entire illusion of power. The stage was set. The morning after Karen's humiliating encounter with the deputy, I expected her to retreat, lick her wounds, and move on to another victim of her endless crusade for control. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. If anything, my refusal to bow down only fueled her obsession. And as I would soon learn, this wasn't just about the lake anymore. It was about her pride, her reputation, and the image she had built as the untouchable queen of the HOA. Word of what had happened spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some residents, who had secretly grown tired of Karen's antics, whispered their support to me from a distance. They admired that someone had finally stood up to her. Others, however, sided with her, convinced by her dramatic retelling of events. She told them I had threatened her son's life, that I had used intimidation tactics to scare families away from enjoying what she called the neighborhood's rightful property. Her ability to twist the truth was astonishing, and for a while, her lies seemed to work. By the end of the week, I noticed an unusual increase in foot traffic around my property. Families strolled by, casting judgmental looks my way. Some even let their children wander dangerously close to the water, as if daring me to stop them. Karen, meanwhile, strutted around like a victorious general, telling anyone who would listen that the community lake would soon be formally added to the HOA's list of shared amenities. The audacity would have been laughable if it weren't. So dangerous. Her son continued to act as though he owned the lake. Almost every day after work, I'd find him lounging near the shore with his friends, music echoing across the water. They treated the area like their personal playground, leaving behind trash, fishing lines, and empty bottles. My patience wore thinner with each passing day. I began documenting everything: photos of the trespassing, videos of the littering, and a log of every interaction. I had learned long ago that when dealing with people like Karen, evidence was the only shield that mattered. But Karen was 2 steps ahead, or so she thought. A week later, I received a letter in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's official letterhead. Inside was a notice of violation, claiming that my refusal to comply with community standards was in direct violation of HOA bylaws. They accused me of endangering community welfare, denying access to shared property, and even failing to maintain landscaping around the lake to neighborhood standards. I almost laughed at the absurdity, because legally they had no jurisdiction over my ranch. My land was never part of the HOA, and no contract bound me to their authority. Yet here was Karen, weaponizing her position, trying to bully me into submission with official-looking paperwork. I didn't take the bait. I filed the letter away with my growing pile of evidence and went about my business. But in the following days, her campaign escalated. Anonymous complaints were lodged against me to the county zoning board, alleging everything from illegal livestock to unpermitted structures on my property. Inspectors showed up unannounced only to find nothing wrong. Karen had set her sights on waging a war of attrition, hoping to bury me under so much harassment that I'd eventually cave. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't fighting alone. The county committee I served on gave me insight into the HOA's inner workings, insight Karen had no idea I possessed. I knew their budgetary weaknesses, their reliance on special assessments, and the fine line they walked between solvency and bankruptcy. I knew exactly how much money they burned on frivolous projects and how much they depended on maintaining the illusion of control to keep dues flowing. One wrong move, one misstep in misallocating funds, and the entire operation could crumble. And Karen was about to hand me that misstep on a silver platter. In her arrogance, she decided to formally announce that the lake was now a community amenity. She printed flyers, distributed them door to door, and even hosted an HOA meeting where she unveiled a glossy mock-up of Lakeview Park, complete with picnic tables, a boat dock, and a budget proposal to make it all happen. Residents applauded, dazzled by the idea of having their own waterfront paradise. Karen beamed with pride, declaring it her crowning achievement as HOA president. But there was one glaring problem. She hadn't secured the lake. Not legally, not financially, not in any way. She had promised the neighborhood something she could never deliver, and worse, she had allocated HOA funds toward developing land that didn't belong to them. When the committee packet landed on my desk a week later, I nearly laughed out loud. Line items appeared for expenses tied to the lake, surveying costs, landscaping deposits, and even a retainer fee for a contractor to build a community dock. Tens of thousands of dollars earmarked for property they had no legal right to touch. Karen had signed off on all of it using HOA dues like a personal checkbook. It was the smoking gun I had been waiting for. Still, I didn't act immediately. I let the rope unspool a little further, watching as she dug herself deeper into the hole. Residents grew excited, telling me how generous I was for donating my lake. Some even thanked me, though I never corrected them. It wasn't my job to clean up Karen's lies. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down, strutting through the neighborhood with a newfound confidence. She believed she had won, that her victory over me was complete. But victory has a way of slipping through the fingers of those who grasp at it too tightly, because as soon as that committee meeting arrived, where the HOA's budget would be reviewed and approved, I planned to bring everything to light. Not just her misuse of funds, but her lies, her harassment, her entire campaign of deceit. She thought she had embarrassed me by calling the cops. She thought she had shamed me with violation letters. But what she didn't know was that she had just set herself up for the most public and devastating downfall of her life. And as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the shimmering lake, I felt a calm resolve settle over me. Karen might have fooled her neighbors. She might have even fooled herself. But soon, everyone would know the truth. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't just be Karen's reputation on the line, it would be her entire HOA kingdom. The storm was coming. The night of the budget review meeting arrived with a kind of tension I hadn't felt in years. Normally, those meetings were dull, filled with predictable discussions about landscaping contracts, trash collection schedules, and the occasional debate over repainting a community sign. But this time, I knew something far more explosive was about to unfold. I had my binder of evidence tucked neatly under my arm, every page marked and organized. Karen thought she was walking into a night of triumph. I knew she was walking into her own downfall. When I arrived at the county hall where the meeting was being held, the parking lot was already overflowing. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood that the HOA would be unveiling its biggest project yet, the so-called Lakeview Park. Residents showed up in droves, eager to see what their dues had paid for. Some came armed with excitement, others with skepticism, but nearly everyone was buzzing with anticipation. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Karen stood at the front of the room, her hair sprayed to perfection, wearing a blazer that screamed authority. Her son was there too, smirking arrogantly in the corner as though he were already the crowned prince of the lake. Around the room, HOA board members shuffled papers and exchanged polite smiles, clearly eager to showcase the project. When the meeting was called to order, Karen wasted no time taking center stage. She launched into her speech with rehearsed confidence, painting vivid pictures of family picnics by the water, community events on the shore, and children growing up with safe, supervised access to their own lake. She gestured toward glossy poster boards propped on easels, mock-ups of the park with walking trails, a dock, and even a planned playground. The crowd murmured in approval, nodding along as she promised a new era of community living. But I sat quietly in the back, flipping through my binder, waiting for the moment when she would reveal the budget. And then it came. Karen cleared her throat, adjusted her blazer, and began reading off the projected expenses. Surveying costs, landscaping, dock construction, playground installation. The numbers added up quickly. Tens of thousands of dollars, all funneled into a project built on property that didn't belong to them. She moved on to revenue projections, proudly announcing that modest increases in HOA dues would cover the expenses, along with lake membership fees she had already begun collecting. The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and groans. Some residents applauded the idea, thrilled at the promise of a private park. Others worried aloud about higher dues. But all of them believed her. Not one person questioned whether the HOA had the legal authority to develop the lake. That was when I raised my hand. At first, Karen tried to ignore me, her eyes narrowing as if willing me to disappear. But when the committee chair acknowledged me, she had no choice but to step aside. I stood, calmly introducing myself as both the owner of the ranch and the lake in question, as well as a member of the very committee reviewing the budget. The room fell into a hush. Karen's confident smile faltered. I began laying out the facts. First, I displayed my deed, highlighting the legal boundaries that clearly showed the lake sat entirely on my property. Next, I held up photographs of the private property, signs I had posted, along with documentation of the times they had been removed. I showed the letter Karen had mailed me, accusing me of violating HOA rules that didn't apply. Then came the videos and photos of her son and his friends trespassing, leaving trash and openly claiming the lake as their own. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing that the community lake wasn't theirs at all. But I wasn't finished. I turned to the budget packet, flipping directly to the line items tied to the lake. I read aloud the amount spent and the contractors retained, making it clear that Karen had authorized the use of HOA funds for property the HOA had no legal claim to. I explained that not only was this a gross misuse of funds, but it could also be considered fraud. The entire room erupted in whispers, voices rising as residents began questioning one another. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice shrill, accusing me of lying, of fabricating documents. But the committee chair silenced her, reminding her that the records I presented were official and verifiable. With every passing moment, her authority crumbled. Her son stood up angrily, shouting that the lake belonged to the people. But the words rang hollow. The residents who had once cheered him on now looked at him with skepticism and embarrassment. Parents who had believed they were buying memberships to a legitimate community amenity suddenly realized they had been duped. The turning point came when one of the board members, clearly shaken, admitted that they had never verified ownership of the lake. They had taken Karen at her word, trusting her leadership blindly. Now faced with undeniable proof, they had no defense. The chair announced that the budget proposal would not only be rejected, but also investigated. The funds already spent would require accounting, and an audit of the HOA's finances would begin immediately. Gasps filled the room. Karen's face turned crimson as the weight of her actions crashed down around her. The residents were furious. Some shouted questions, demanding refunds for the lake memberships they had purchased. Others called for Karen's resignation on the spot. The board, sensing their own reputations were at stake, distanced themselves from her instantly. And me? I sat back down, calm and collected, knowing that my part was done. I didn't need to scream or gloat. The truth had spoken louder than anything else. But Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. Even as the meeting dissolved into chaos, she tried to claw back control. She accused me of sabotaging the community, of hiding behind technicalities, of being a selfish man hoarding resources. Her son backed her up, yelling insults and threats as residents filed out, shaking their heads in disbelief. But their words no longer carried weight. By the time the meeting adjourned, Karen was a pariah. Her grand plan had collapsed, her credibility shredded. But I knew her well enough to understand she wouldn't go quietly. People like her never did. And as I drove home that night, the lake glimmering in the distance, I realized this was only the beginning. Karen had lost her grip on the HOA, but she would come back swinging. She had too much pride, too much venom, to let it end here. The battle was far from over. The weeks following the budget meeting were some of the most tense the neighborhood had ever experienced. For years, Karen had ruled the HOA like a monarch, issuing decrees and punishments with absolute confidence. But now, the mask had slipped. Her neighbors had seen her lies unravel in real time. Her Lakeview Park project, once touted as her legacy, had been exposed as a sham. Yet instead of retreating into quiet shame, she lashed out with a fury that consumed everything in her. Path. Her retaliation began subtly. Small acts, the kind designed to irritate but not leave obvious fingerprints. Trash began appearing at the edge of my property. Fast food bags, broken bottles, and torn flyers. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence, but the frequency made it clear. This was deliberate. Then came the anonymous phone calls. Late at night, my landline would ring, and silence would greet me on the other end before a click ended the call. Petty harassment, but harassment all the same. Karen wasn't content with subtlety for long. She rallied her remaining loyalists, the handful of neighbors who either feared her wrath or still believed her narrative. Together, they launched a smear campaign. Online neighborhood forums filled with posts painting me as a greedy recluse who had stolen the community's lake. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards claiming I was endangering families by keeping the water inaccessible. Some even suggested I was planning to sell the land to developers, turning the lake into a private resort and stripping the community of its heritage. It was absurd, of course, but lies have a way of spreading faster than truth. And Karen wielded lies like weapons. One afternoon, I returned home to find a group of residents gathered near the shore, staging what they called a peaceful demonstration. They held handmade signs demanding access to the lake, chanting slogans about fairness and community rights. Karen stood among them, her face red with indignation, shouting about how I had betrayed the neighborhood. The hypocrisy was staggering. She had stolen money, lied to her neighbors, and manipulated them into believing the impossible, yet somehow, I was the villain. The sheriff's deputies were called again, and once more, they sided with me. The protesters were told to disperse, reminded that they were trespassing on private property. But every call to law enforcement seemed to feed Karen's narrative. She spun each incident into a story of me using the police to silence the people. it was clear. She wasn't trying to win in court or in logic. She was trying to win in perception, but perception doesn't balance a budget. And while she stirred chaos in the streets, the HOA audit was quietly grinding forward in the background. The auditors dug into the financial records with meticulous detail, uncovering misallocation after misallocation. It wasn't just the lake. Project Karen had been dipping into HOA funds for years, masking personal expenses as community improvements. Landscaping invoices tied to companies owned by distant relatives, overpriced maintenance contracts awarded without competitive bidding, even a suspicious line item for administrative expenses that turned out to be a thinly veiled slush fund. Her empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. I knew it was only a matter of time before the audit report reached the residents. And when it did, Karen's last remnants of credibility would disintegrate. But before that day arrived, she made one final desperate move. Late one Saturday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard engines roaring near the lake. I rushed outside to find Karen's son and a group of his friends driving ATVs across my land, tearing deep ruts into the soil and skidding dangerously close to the water's edge. They whooped and hollered as though it were a game, their headlights slicing through the twilight. My patience finally snapped. I documented everything, recording their reckless joyride with my phone. When I shouted for them to leave, they only laughed, revving their engines louder, circling me like predators taunting their prey. It was a show of defiance, a message. We can do whatever we want. Eventually, they sped off into the night, leaving, behind shredded earth and broken fencing. This time, I didn't just file a complaint. I pressed charges. The deputies arrived, reviewed the footage, and agreed that this had crossed a line into criminal territory. Karen's son was cited for trespassing and property damage, and his friends were warned that further incidents would lead to arrests. The look on Karen's face as she arrived on scene, screaming at the officers, insisting her son was innocent, was etched with desperation. Her power was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. But even then, she didn't stop. The very next week, she called an emergency HOA meeting. In a fiery tirade, she announced that the HOA would be filing a lawsuit against me for withholding community property. She claimed she had new evidence proving the lake was meant for public use. Neighbors gasped, some nodding in agreement, others rolling their eyes. But as the words left her mouth, I realized what she was doing. She wasn't trying to win a case. She was trying to stall, to buy time, to appear strong while the audit loomed like a storm cloud over her head. And sure enough, within days, her plan backfired spectacularly. The audit report was released, a thick packet of damning evidence distributed to every resident. Page after page detailed financial mismanagement, unauthorized expenses, and blatant abuse of power. The lake debacle was highlighted as the most egregious example, but it was far from the only one. Residents were stunned, betrayed. Those who had once defended her now turned their backs, realizing they had been pawns in her game. Demands for her resignation grew louder, not just in whispers, but in public meetings, on forums, even in letters to the county. The board, eager to salvage their own reputations, began distancing themselves further, quietly discussing interim leadership. For Karen, it was the beginning of the end. But if I had learned anything by then, it was that Karen would never go quietly. She thrived on conflict, and if she was going down, she would do everything in her power to drag others with her. And though I had won battle after battle, I knew the war wasn't over. Because cornered animals fight the hardest, and Karen, stripped of her throne and desperate to cling to relevance, was more dangerous than ever. By the time autumn arrived, the neighborhood no longer resembled the tidy, tightly controlled enclave Karen had once ruled. The pristine lawns and neatly trimmed hedges seemed almost ironic, a facade masking the chaos within. Karen's empire, was crumbling, and everyone could see it. What had once been whispered in corners was now shouted openly. The queen of the HOA had fallen. The audit report had been the first hammer strike. Residents pored over the details, stunned by the sheer scale of her misconduct. Years of trust had been shattered in a matter of pages. Every special assessment they had been strong-armed into paying, every arbitrary increase in dues, every mysterious project that seemed to vanish into thin air, it all now bore Karen's fingerprints. Her so-called community initiatives had often been nothing more than disguised cash grabs. At first, she denied everything. She stormed into meetings with fiery speeches, claiming the auditors were corrupt, the documents forged, and I, the lake owner, was the mastermind behind it all. She accused me of hacking records, of paying off officials, of conducting a smear campaign to destroy her. Her words grew increasingly desperate, her gestures frantic, her once commanding presence now a shadow of itself. But denial can only carry a person so far. When the county announced it would pursue legal action over the misuse of funds, Karen's loyalists began to abandon her one by one. Board members who once sang her praises now spoke carefully, distancing themselves from her decisions. Some even apologized publicly, claiming they had been misled by her leadership. The betrayal cut her deeply, but it was a wound of her own making. Meanwhile, the community itself began to splinter. Families who had trusted Karen to protect their interests now questioned the very purpose of the HOA. Heated debates erupted in online forums and at community gatherings. Some called for the dissolution of the association altogether, arguing that it had been nothing but a vehicle for Karen's tyranny. Others insisted the HOA could be saved, but only if Karen was removed immediately. Her once fearsome grip had become a liability. And yet, she clung to power with the desperation of someone who had built her entire identity around control. She called emergency meetings, issued newsletters filled with self-pitying rants, and staged impromptu rallies on neighborhood lawns. Each effort only deepened the divide. Those who still supported her grew louder but fewer, while the majority rolled their eyes at her theatrics. It was around this time that Karen made her boldest and perhaps most foolish move. One morning, as I sipped coffee on my porch overlooking the lake, I saw workers unloading equipment near the water. At first, I thought it was maintenance crews from the county, but as I walked closer, I realized it was a construction team. They had blueprints, stakes, and measuring tools, clear signs of preparation for a major project. When I asked what they were doing, one of the workers shrugged and said they had been hired by the HOA to begin preliminary work on a dock. I felt a cold wave of disbelief. After everything, after the audit, the budget rejection, the legal warnings, Karen had still tried to move forward with her fantasy project. I called the deputies immediately, showing them my deed and the audit report. The workers, once informed of the situation, packed up their tools and left, muttering about wasted time. But the message was clear. Karen wasn't living in reality anymore. She was grasping at illusions, willing to risk everything just to prove she hadn't lost. The deputies issued her a formal warning that evening. Any further attempts to use HOA funds for unauthorized projects would be treated as fraud. I watched from a distance as they spoke to her outside her home. Her son paced angrily, fists clenched, while she argued until her voice cracked. For the first time, I saw genuine fear flicker across her face. And still, she didn't stop. The smear campaigns intensified. My mailbox filled with anonymous letters calling me a thief, a parasite, even a lake tyrant. Online, Karen spread rumors that I was planning to sell my ranch to developers for millions, that I was secretly in debt and exploiting the HOA's downfall to save myself. None of it was true, but the constant barrage was exhausting. Neighbors I had never spoken to approached me cautiously, asking for the truth. I showed them the documents, the evidence, the undeniable proof of Karen's lies. Slowly, more people began to see her for what she was. The tide had turned fully against her. Her downfall reached its peak at the next HOA election. The turnout was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Families who had long ignored HOA politics showed up in droves, eager to cast their votes. The gymnasium where the election was held buzzed with anticipation. Karen strutted in, her head held high, dressed in her usual blazer, but the crowd's reaction told the whole story. There were no cheers, no nods of respect, only glares and whispers. When the votes were counted, the result was decisive. Karen had not only lost her presidency, but had been ousted from the board entirely. The announcement was met with thunderous applause. For the first time in years, residents felt a weight lift from their shoulders. Karen's face, once smug with authority, twisted with disbelief. She shouted that the election was rigged, that ballots had been tampered with, that a conspiracy had formed against her. But her words carried no weight. No one listened anymore. As she stormed out of the gymnasium, dragging her son behind her, I realized this was the true collapse of a queen who had built her throne on sand. Her kingdom had crumbled, not because of me, but because of her own hubris. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't finished. People like Karen rarely vanish quietly into the night. Even stripped of power, they cling to bitterness, to vendettas, to the belief that the world has wronged them. And as I looked out across my lake that evening, peaceful once more, I wondered what her next move would be. Because while the HOA might have freed itself from her rule, Karen's story wasn't over. Not yet. Karen's removal from the HOA presidency should have marked the end of the saga. For most people, public humiliation on that scale would have been enough to force retreat. She had lost her title, her influence, and the blind loyalty of her neighbors. The lake was safe, the audit complete, the budget secured. By all accounts, the war was over, but with Karen, nothing was ever simple. In the weeks after her ousting, she became a ghostly presence in the neighborhood. She no longer marched around issuing citations or dictating rules, but her shadow still lingered. I'd catch glimpses of her car parked near the entrance to my ranch, headlights off, as if she were watching. Neighbors reported seeing her wandering the sidewalks late at night, muttering to herself about conspiracies and betrayals. She wasn't ruling anymore. She was unraveling. Her son, humiliated by the trespassing charges and stripped of his illusory ownership of the lake, grew increasingly hostile. He lashed out at neighbors who mocked him, fought with his former friends, and was eventually banned from several local businesses for his behavior. The family that had once embodied control and superiority was now a spectacle of dysfunction, and then came Karen's final act of defiance. One quiet Saturday afternoon, I was working on repairs near the lake when I heard shouting. At first, I thought it was just kids playing, but the voice grew louder, shriller, unmistakable. Karen. She had marched straight onto my land, her son trailing behind her with a video camera. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, declaring that the lake was stolen property and that she was there to reclaim it for the people. It wasn't a protest. It was a breakdown. Her son circled with the camera, narrating dramatically about corruption and oppression, clearly hoping to post the footage online and rally whatever supporters they had left. Karen stomped toward the water's edge, waving her arms like a prophet delivering a sermon. She shouted that no piece of paper could erase the community's rights, that no fraudulent audit could silence her, that I was nothing more than a thief who had conned the entire county. I didn't confront her, not directly. I simply dialed the sheriff's office and began recording from my own phone. Within minutes, deputies arrived, this time with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. Karen resisted, of course. She refused to step off my property, insisting it was hers. When the deputies tried to guide her away, she screamed louder, accusing them of being complicit in my supposed crimes. Her son shoved his camera into their faces, demanding they confess to corruption, The scene spiraled until the deputies finally placed Karen in handcuffs, her voice breaking into incoherent shrieks as she was escorted away. It was the moment everything ended. The footage spread quickly, not because her son posted it, but because I shared mine with the authorities, who in turn released it when the case reached court. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as their former leader, once feared and obeyed, was reduced to a spectacle of rage and denial. The woman who had terrorized families over mailbox colors and grass height was now a cautionary tale of arrogance and obsession. The charges against her included trespassing, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds. Combined with the civil lawsuits, piling up from angry residents demanding refunds, Karen's world collapsed completely. She and her son moved out of the neighborhood shortly after, their home sold at a loss. Word spread that she had relocated to a smaller town where, predictably, she tried to join another HOA board, only to be rejected once her history came to light. For the first time in years, peace settled over the neighborhood. The new HOA leadership, humbled by the chaos of Karen's reign, shifted their focus toward transparency. Meetings became less about control and more about collaboration. Budgets were posted openly, decisions voted on fairly, and the sense of community, long buried under Karen's iron fist, began to return. Families who had once been divided by her manipulations slowly reconciled. As for me, I reclaimed my lake. No more trespassers, no more bogus violations, no more absurd claims of community ownership. I stocked the waters again, repaired the damage from the ATV incident, and restored the shoreline. Sitting on my porch in the evenings, I could finally enjoy the sight of the water glistening in peace. But the experience left me with lessons I wouldn't soon forget. I'd always assumed HOAs were nothing more than harmless bureaucracies, overzealous, about aesthetics perhaps, but ultimately benign. Karen proved how dangerous unchecked power could be, even on such a small scale. She taught me that arrogance, when combined with authority, could warp into tyranny. And she showed me how fragile a community could become when fear silenced truth. In the end, it wasn't anger or shouting that defeated her. It was patience, evidence, and the simple power of truth. The lake was never hers to give away. The budget was never hers to control. And the neighborhood was never truly hers to rule. Karen had built her kingdom on lies. And like all kingdoms, built on sand, it eventually collapsed under its own weight. The queen of the HOA was gone, and all that remained was the still, quiet lake, finally free of her shadow.